Hey, before we start, do me a small favor. Put your phone down, or at least turn it face down. Grab a coffee, tea, water, whatever liquid best represents calm acceptance of reality for you, and just listen. Because today, we're not talking about murder. We're not talking about bank robberies. We're not even talking about tax evasion. Today, we're talking about something much stranger: fishing from the back of a camel, which sounds like a joke, like something someone made up to fill space on a weird laws website. But buried inside real legal codes, real court cases, and real regulatory language are rules that very seriously cared about what animal you were sitting on while fishing: horses, donkeys, mules, and yes, camels. And once you start asking why any government would care whether you're fishing from a camel, you stumble into a strange world of ancient property law, colonial bureaucracy, animal classification problems, and the uncomfortable realization that a lot of laws still exist not because they make sense, but because nobody ever bothered to remove them. So let's begin with an important clarification. There is no single famous global law that says it is illegal to fish from a camel. That sentence never appears verbatim. Instead, there are dozens of laws across time and geography that regulate fishing methods so precisely that camels end up mattering. Not because lawmakers hated camels, but because animals break legal logic in very annoying ways. To understand this, we need to go back to a time when fishing laws were not about protecting fish, they were about controlling people. For most of history, rivers were not public, lakes were not public, coastlines were not public. Water was property. Kings owned rivers, nobles owned stretches of coast, religious institutions owned lakes. Fishing without permission wasn't illegal fishing, it was theft. And theft laws get very specific very fast. If you're standing on land owned by one person, casting into water owned by another, using a tool made by a third, who exactly are you stealing from? Medieval law cared deeply about that question, and animals made it worse. If you're on foot, you're clearly trespassing on land. If you're in a boat, you're clearly occupying water. But what if you're on an animal that can stand on land, walk into water, and move across boundaries without stopping? That question mattered enough to write laws about it. In many early fishing codes, especially in Europe and later in colonial territories, fishing from horseback was explicitly regulated or banned. Not because horses were cheating, but because mounted fishing allowed people to access water without technically entering it on foot. You could remain on land while exploiting water rights, and lawyers hated that. Camels complicated this even more. Camels were not common in Europe, but they were extremely common in colonial regions where European legal systems were imposed onto landscapes they didn't fully understand. North Africa, the Middle East, parts of South Asia. Colonial administrators brought with them European fishing laws designed for rivers and boats and horses, and then encountered camels. And camels did not fit. Camels could wade into water deeper than horses. They could carry fishing gear, nets, traps, and even people for long distances without boats. They could cross salt flats, deserts, riverbanks, and shallow waters that boats couldn't reach. From the perspective of colonial regulators, camels were mobile fishing platforms, and mobile fishing platforms were dangerous. Because fishing laws were never just about catching fish, they were about preventing people from bypassing control. In many regions, fishing rights were tied to permits issued for boats. If you weren't in a registered boat, you weren't supposed to fish. But what if you weren't in a boat? What if you were technically on land, but also in water? So lawmakers did what lawmakers always do when reality gets messy. They wrote extremely specific rules. Fishing while mounted on an animal, fishing while mounted on an animal capable of entering water, fishing while mounted on a beast of burden. And once you do that, camels are unavoidable. In British colonial India, for example, Fisheries Acts regulated mechanized vessels, non-mechanized vessels, and other conveyances. Camels fell into that last category. In some regions, fishing from any animal used for transport was restricted in order to prevent large-scale net fishing without oversight. The same logic appeared in parts of North Africa under French administration. Fishing laws defined legal methods based on whether the fisher was stationary, mobile, or mounted. Mounted fishing allowed access to protected breeding grounds near shores and riverbanks, which were often off-limits. Camels mattered because they allowed people to fish where boats couldn't go and regulators didn't want them to. But this wasn't just a colonial problem. Even in Europe, animal-based fishing laws existed. In some regions, fishing from horseback was banned to prevent mounted poaching along riverbanks. The concern wasn't the horse, it was speed. A mounted fisher could cover large stretches of river quickly, evade guards, and transport fish efficiently. Replace horse with camel in regions where camels existed, and the logic stays the same. Now here's where it gets interesting. These laws didn't disappear when the circumstances that created them did, because law is sticky. Once a regulation is written, removing it requires effort. It requires political will. It requires someone to notice it still exists. And weird laws are often low priority. Nobody's lobbying hard to repeal obscure fishing restrictions with camels, so they stay. Long after camels stop being relevant, long after fishing methods change, long after nobody remembers why the law was written in the first place. This is why even today, you can find fishing regulations that classify animals in ways that seem absurd, rules that differentiate between vehicles, vessels, and animals, even though modern fishing rarely involves any of them. The law doesn't evolve smoothly, it accretes, like barnacles, and sometimes those barnacles are camels. There's also another layer to this: fairness. Fishing regulations have always tried, sometimes poorly, to prevent unfair advantage. Nets were regulated because they caught too much. Certain traps were banned because they destroyed breeding populations. Mobility itself became a target. If you can move faster, carry more equipment, and access more territory, you can outcompete others. Mounted fishing was seen as unfair advantage, so laws restricted it. And again, camels were exceptionally good at being unfair. They could carry heavy nets. They could travel long distances without water. They could stand in shallow lagoons for hours. From the perspective of regulators trying to protect local fishing communities, or at least control them, camels were a problem. Now, did anyone ever get arrested specifically for fishing from a camel? Almost certainly, but those cases rarely survive in records because the camel wasn't the headline. The violation was illegal fishing. The camel was just the method. Which brings us to the modern era. Today, most fishing laws don't explicitly mention camels. They don't need to. Instead, they regulate vehicles, vessels, or animals, and camels fall through the cracks. But the logic remains. If someone today tried to fish from a camel in a protected area, regulators wouldn't cite camel fishing. They'd cite illegal access, prohibited methods, or wildlife disturbance. The camel is no longer special. But it was. And the fact that it ever mattered at all tells us something important about how law works. Laws are not written for edge cases until someone finds one. Then the law stretches, or breaks, or gets patched with oddly specific language, and sometimes that patch survives for centuries. This is why legal codes are full of bizarre specificity, why you'll find references to animals, tools, and behaviors that no longer exist in practice. They're fossils, legal fossils, and camels fishing is one of them. So next time you see a list of weird laws online, remember this. Most of them weren't written to be weird, they were written to solve real problems in real contexts that no longer exist, and nobody cleaned up after. Which raises a deeper question. What laws today seem perfectly reasonable, but will look completely absurd in 200 years? Rules about drones, about data, about AI, about digital property. Someday, someone will read our laws the way we read camel fishing regulations and think, what were they worried about? And the answer will be the same: people, control, fairness, and edge cases that got out of hand. If you enjoyed this, do me another favor. Like the video, share it with someone who appreciates strange facts and legal absurdities. And leave a comment, because the algorithm, much like ancient fishing law, is a mysterious system that rewards participation whether it makes sense or not. And hey, relax. You're allowed to fish from a camel now. Probably. Thanks for listening.